What are the commonalities among leaders who sustain excellence over an extended period of time?
Cody Keenan, great to have you here on the Learning Leaders Show. Welcome.
Thanks, Ryan. It's good to be with you.
So I want to jump into the middle of your career, and then we're going to go in a little bit more sequential order. And so let's go to 2015. You're working on an important speech for President Obama. This is the State of the Union address. And you turn in the speech to, I read this, you turn in the speech to President Obama 8 days early, which apparently is a record. Normally it's more up to the wire. And I had read that he summoned you to the private dining area in the White House to talk to you about this. Can you tell me what happened next?
Yeah. And to give you a little background on it, I mean, the State of the Union address is something that every speechwriter dreams of writing until you actually get to do it, because it's awful. It's a laundry list. You have to jam everything in there. Everybody's coming at you with their policies and whatnot. So I felt like I had, and you ruin your Christmas doing it every year. I ruined my family's Christmas 4 years in a row. So I felt like I had something that was in the best shape of one of these had been in 8 days out. It was kind of as pure as a State of the Union could get. Everything was in there. It all made sense. It flowed really well, which is difficult in these things. And so, I expected to hear from him right away. And a full day goes by, and now I'm starting to freak out a little bit. And so his assistant Ferio calls and says, "Hey, can you come upstairs?" Because my office was underneath the Oval Office. So I go up, and he's not sitting in the Oval, which is strange. I'm like, "Where is he?" She said, "He's back in the dining room. He wants you to go in there." I said, "Okay." So I go back in there, and all I want to know is whether the speech is good or not. I haven't even shared it with anybody else at this point. And he takes his sweet time. He says, "Hey, brother, sit down." So I sit down. He's eating, he eats like he's monkish in his eating habits. It's chicken, it's vegetables, it's a little like quinoa or something. So he's munching on a carrot stick, and he goes, "How you doing?" I tell him I'm fine, and I'm just like, enough with the small talk, let's like get to it. So finally he says, "I think we're in the best shape we've been in 8 days out, this far out." And so everything, my body relaxes. And then he says, "But," and I tense up again. He says, "We have 8 more days, so let's make it better." Here's the thing. Everything is in here. Every sentence says something. Every word means something. And I just tell him, "Yeah, that's what these State of the Union addresses are." He says, No. It's what I'm trying to say is the entire speech is up at a 10. And I need some of it down at 8, 6, 4. I need some emotional moments and some quiet moments. And I'm sort of picking up what he's putting down, but it's still, the State of the Union address just isn't one of those speeches. And he says, "Let me put it another way. You ever listen to Miles Davis?" And I said, "Not really. I wasn't really into jazz." And he said, "Well, here's the thing about Miles Davis. It's the notes you don't play. It's the silences. It's the space between. That's what made him so good. So I want you to go home tonight. Don't do any work. Pour yourself a drink, listen to some Miles Davis, and come back here tomorrow and find me some silences." And then I got it. I actually did listen to him and listen to some Miles Davis, and came back in and as much as you can with the State of the Union, made it a little lyrical, brought it down in some parts, gave it some pauses and silences. And no State of the Union address is ever going to be carved into a memorial, but that one I think was pretty good.
I think it's a rare quality in a person that they can be both the great writer and the orator and the teacher, right? Like have this deep understanding of highs and lows. It's like you listen to a concert. Sometimes they do have to play the quieter songs, since it was just at a 10 the whole time. You'd probably be exhausted 30 minutes in or 40 minutes in, but I don't know if I could ever put that into words. When you walked back to your office after that moment, what were you thinking?
Mostly I was relieved that I wasn't going to have to rewrite an 8,000 word speech. I was actually thinking, I was a little embarrassed, because it is something I intrinsically knew about speech writing, that it is also like speech giving is a performance.
Yep.
And because the State of the Union address is its own unique beast, I had just lost sight of that in my desperate attempts to get everything in there that needed to be in there. But he's got two skills that most speakers don't, and I've worked with a lot. One is he's an active writer, and he's actively engaged in the process. I haven't worked with many other people who will dive in with their pen and just edit the heck out of everything. And it's because he's a writer first and foremost. I mean, he has told me a million times that he wrote the '04 convention speech himself, that he wrote Dreams from My Father himself. It's like, I know. Um, so that's number one, very helpful, because he is now, by the time he gets up to speak, he has internalized everything. The flip side to that is Donald Trump used a teleprompter too, and when he did, he actually exposed himself as never having read the speech before. Just as an example, I remember early in COVID, he said something like, um, "People get a flu shot every year. Not a lot of people know that. No, we all know that. You didn't, and you just proved to everybody that you didn't know that." Um, so, like I said, it's kind of like a sheet music when it goes in the teleprompter. And I said there were kind of two things that made Obama unique. The other is the performance aspect. Delivery is not just reading a speech. You are actually performing with your eyes, with your body, with your hands. You're conducting an audience, and that's a powerful thing. You don't ever want to let a captive audience go to waste. But when you are writing a speech, and then when you're delivering a speech, you're thinking about how you can actually conduct the audience. You can move people to laugh, applaud, cheer, boo, even though I don't recommend it, and ultimately move them to action. So being able to work for him was always such a blessing, because he was so good at both parts of it.
There's I think a lot of people that are interested in this show, Cody, that are like an SVP at a Fortune 50 company, and they give regular, let's say, town hall addresses, even sometimes weekly addresses to the senior leadership team. And I think they could benefit from hearing from one of the greatest speechwriters of all time, that I'm fortunate to have here today, of how they could be better at this. I know it's different than being the president of the United States, but there are some similarities to giving a great presentation, to making your Monday morning address to your team a really excellent one, as opposed to the boring ones that most of them are. What pieces of advice would you give to that person who's preparing for their Monday speech, or preparing for the quarterly town hall where they're going to address a few thousand people maybe about their company? What are some ways that they could do that really well?
Be direct, be colloquial, be concise, be engaging. I mean, all that sounds pretty obvious. I'm going to give myself in a little bit of trouble here, because um, I have some corporate clients now. I'm at a speechwriting firm called Fenway,
Yep.
and a lot of times you just need to ignore your comms team. That's the part
Really?
that's going to get me in trouble. There is there's so much fear involved in corporate communications, in a way that we were fortunate never to have at the White House. But there's a fear of what you can't say. You can't say this, you can't say that, you can't say that. And then there's also this habit to cling to things that you think you're supposed to say. He or she has to say this, has to say that. That's not always true. Just throw that all out. You should approach. I know that you are beholden to shareholders and the board, and you don't ever want to rock the boat, right? That's where all this fear comes from. But every speech should tell a story, even if it's just a quick message to your own employees, a story with a beginning, a middle, and the end. And it should be conversational. It should sound like you. It should be a speech only you can give. And if you're getting twisted around the axle with, um, he or she has to say this, he or she can't say that, it often makes a speech kind of a mess. So you want it to feel normal. You want it to be normal. I mean, there's this, you want to be authentic, which sounds like such a cliche, but a lot of comms shops, and this was true in the White House too, and policy people and lawyers that we always had to deal with. If you are constantly worried about what you can or can't say, that just wears away at your authenticity. Like, being authentic is actually very easy. You just have to get rid of your fear.
Why do you think that fear is exists? I'm with you. I've been in those meetings, in the seats, watching the person. Like, Is it just I don't want to get fired? I mean, why does it exist?
I think it's simply a fear of I don't want to cause a problem. I don't want
Yeah.
to cause an optics problem. I don't want to have to do any cleanup. Um, and generally, that's not something you actually have to be afraid of. I remember the few times in the White House where everybody get all twerked up about, can Obama say this? Can Obama come out for marriage equality? That landed with like just a pillow soft whimper because the country was already ahead of Obama on marriage equality. He was actually behind there. And for all of the, everybody's just kind of twisted in a knot. How is this going to be received? How's it going to play? It played great because, by that point, most of the country was in favor of marriage equality. That's just one of the first examples that came to mind. But it usually those fears are unwarranted or overblown, and people appreciate it if um, you just my first instinct is to say just tell the truth, but one of the most radical things in politics is when you just tell the truth that everybody already knows, but most people have been too afraid to say. And it doesn't actually, it feels like it requires a lot of courage to do that, but it really doesn't. And so I think people gravitate to leaders, whether in the public or private sector, who come across as fearless, who come across as in control and self-confident and know what they want to say and why. And that doesn't mean you have to, push the envelope or say something provocative. Again, oftentimes it feels provocative if somebody says something we all already know. We've just been desperate to hear from our leadership.
That's what stand-up comedians, the best ones, do that so well, right? They're able to bring voice to something that you were already thinking, and they do it in a funny way. And I think leaders can learn a lot from watching the best stand-up comedians because they do that. You also said that every speech should tell a story, and I think of my favorite bosses and coaches that I've either played for or worked for, and they were really good at this. They may open with a compelling, interesting story and then weave that into how that applies to me sitting in that seat, or to how I could take inspiration from that to go do my job. When you as a speechwriter, how do you think about storytelling? How do you put, like, write them in? Where should they go? Do you open with them, close with them? Like, talk to me about storytelling within speechwriting.
There is no way you could have known this, but your timing is perfect. So I teach speech writing at Northwestern University, and this week's assignment is storytelling.
Hmm.
And I tell them all, you are running for president of the United States. But the purpose of this assignment is I want you to take a story out of your own life, or it can be somebody else's who you know or have met. Tell that story, but you need to do it in a way that connects to everybody in the audience so that it's actually a story about something bigger. And one of the best examples of this is Barack Obama's 2004 convention speech, the one that rocketed him from anonymous state senator to global megastar in 17 minutes. He told his story, the story of the son of a Kenyan, a black man from Kenya, and a white woman from Kansas, barely knew his father, grew up all over the world, raised by his white grandparents, and told it in a way that made it seem like the most quintessentially American thing possible, even though this is a guy who is very different from the typical political leader that you see on stage. He immediately said, in a blunt kind of off ramp, in no other country on earth could my story even be possible.
Hmm.
And then he's off and running telling the American story. And now he has just woven himself into it in a completely opposite way from the way most leaders do. I mean, most of our presidents, well, all of our presidents for him were white guys, but most of them came up through prep schools and Harvard or Yale and had people around them forever. And here's a guy who just, a week before that speech was pumping his own gas. And he comes across as just like the most American guy possible. So there are a couple different ways to tell stories. You can tell your own if people don't know it. You can tell somebody else's. A lot of times in the White House, we took stories out of letters to the president, like letters that people actually wrote him, and wove those into speeches. But you're not just doing it to tell that story. You're doing it to connect to something universal. You're kind of basically telling the audience, I am one of you, without having to say it. I think too, back to that same 2015 State of the Union address, that was the only one where we didn't work in stories of a lot of people who were sitting up in the first lady's box, and at the speech. We just used one. And we told the story of this woman named Rebecca Earler who'd written a letter to the president. And we kept coming back to her throughout the entire speech. And that was an implicit way to connect with the audience at home. And rather than just say, I am fighting for you, I understand you, I feel your pain, he told the story of this woman that a lot of people could see themselves in. And that's an even more powerful way to connect to your audience. And they, that was the highest testing State of the Union address we ever did afterwards. And it was because he told the story of this woman that a lot of people could see themselves in. They'd be watching on TV and say, I know that woman. I am that woman. That's my life.
You started as an intern and in Congress, and 10 years later, you're the chief speechwriter to the President of the United States. That is an insane career arc that seems almost impossible. How did you do it?
I mean, on the one hand, there's obviously tons of hard work and late nights and weekends, but there's also a ton of luck and privilege involved. Just the mere fact that I could intern in Congress right out of college was because I had parents who could help me with the rent for a couple months, right? So that immediately gives you a leg up. And then a lot of it's just being in the right place at the right time. I had a mentor. I worked for Ted Kennedy right out of the gate, and I had a mentor, a woman named Stephanie Cutter, who was his communications director. She went on to be communications director on the Kerry presidential campaign in '04, and a young speechwriter on that campaign was named John Favreau, and she connected the two of us early in the Obama campaign, and we hit it off right away. But without that lightning bolt, who knows where I am right now? I have no idea what I would be doing right now. So it's always hard work and luck and not being a jerk. Those are pretty simple rules. Work hard and don't be an a-hole. But there's a lot of luck involved too.
I read that one of the first speeches, maybe the first speech you wrote was for Senator Ted Kennedy, and it was right after President Obama's 2004 Democratic Convention speech. And you wrote, to see someone else speak words I'd written sent electricity right up my spine and out my hair. What's that like when your words are being spoken by somebody else on TV, on stage, or obviously in the biggest stages in the world? What was that like at the beginning, and then how did you grow into that role and to eventually be chosen by the most powerful person on the planet to write for him?
Yeah, it's amazing. Sorry, you're probably hearing my daughter crying in the background, but it was kind of like that. It was kind of like crying the first time I saw somebody give a speech of mine. It was I probably felt like the first time somebody gave Eddie Van Halen a guitar. You've suddenly got this power that you didn't know you had before. And I still have the first speech I ever wrote for Ted Kennedy. He was nice enough to sign it afterwards and say, welcome to the speechwriting team, even though we didn't really have a speechwriting team, just everybody kind of wrote. And then I got to write a few more for him. But that first one and those successive ones, they weren't very good. I'll go back and look at them now and I'm like, yeesh. I would love to rewrite that speech now. And I still feel the same way about a bunch of speeches I wrote for Obama in the White House. I'd still be editing my book if the publisher didn't have a deadline. Because all great speeches are 90% rewriting. But I got better over time through hard work, through practice, through John Favreau became a mentor too. He's still one of my best friends in the world, but he was patient with teaching me how to write for Obama. And it's always, writing for every person is different. You need to get inside their head, understand their worldview, because it's even more important than what they want to say is why they want to say it. So I had the privilege of leaning on John for a long time until he ultimately left and I took his place.
It was interesting. I read a lot about you guys when you were in office because you were so young. And I mean, that was a big part of the story. Young, like good-looking guys, amazing writers. Axelrod calls you the wordsmiths, and I love how hard it is to get the thoughts out of your mind down on the page. That's why all leaders absolutely must have a writing practice, because it creates clarity of thought. You don't fully know what you believe until you're forced to get those words out of your head down onto the page. And so to have the most powerful person in the world is surrounded by these 20-some-year-old guys who are writing his speeches blew my mind. What was it about the youth? And he could have chosen any person in the world, any group of people to be on that team. And it's Favreau and it's you and these young guys. What was it about your youth that it seemed to be, or was it just the work and you just happened to be young in addition to the work being great? What was it that I think he liked in you guys?
Well, we were much better looking 15 years ago. Um, but politics is often a young person's game just because the hours are so grueling.
Yeah.
We're not digging ditches or working with our hands or anything like that. But aside from typing, but that's not what I mean. But you work straight through weekends, you pull all-nighters, you have to, and it doesn't pay very well. My first paid job in Congress was $18,000 a year. That's why you live with six people in a townhouse, and drink cheap beer and search for happy hours with free food. My first job in the White House paid 45,000, and so you can be in the most powerful place on earth. And for the first 2 weeks in the White House, I had a negative bank balance. And another speechwriter on our team named Adam Frankel was quietly buying me lunch without telling anybody. And it's not like I was living on the streets or anything. It's just I needed that first paycheck to come in to cover it. But it's a young person's game in terms of hours and pay.
Okay.
But the drawback to that actually is that we didn't have all sorts of life experience yet. The only lives we knew were we all basically grew up as relatively privileged white people, and we were 27 years old. And part of being a speechwriter is having a deep sense of empathy, being able to understand your audience, walk around in their shoes, and there are limits to that. All of us are really well read because that makes you a good speechwriter too. But that was actually a net negative for us to all be young and not have all that life experience.
But that was his choice, though. So why was that? Is it because it was before you started, before you got married, before you had kids, before you could basically dedicate your life to the job, and that was attractive in addition to being a good writer? I mean, because you could, like I said, you could choose pretty much anybody.
Yep.
And he chose you guys.
Yeah, we all shared a worldview, which makes it a big difference. You don't want a speechwriter who is diametrically opposed to you, not just in policy, but in the way you see the world. And the way we saw it was, we thought politics was a force for good, a force to change the country, a way to, if you rally enough people to your cause, you can change things for the better. And we all viewed, and a lot of this came from Obama too, just rubbing off on us, but we all viewed, our mission as Americans, coming straight out of the founding documents, was to make this country more perfect. And I fully bought in. I happened to be on the floor in 2004 in Boston when he gave that speech, and I was fully bought into the idea that our mission as Americans is to make this country a better place. And what makes America exceptional and different from other countries is that America can change. We're not built on any bloodline or religion or aristocratic background. We are a beautiful mess of all sorts of different people, and it's incumbent upon us to make sure not just everybody's created equal, but everybody's involved in this, and this country works for everyone. And that all sounds preachy, but it's a way of answering the question, which is we all bought in. We all shared a similar worldview to him, and that just made our collaborations that much better.
I was looking for an uncommon commonality between you and me, and one of the things I found after a lot of digging was the fact that you played high school quarterback. I played quarterback in high school and in college and a little bit after college for a little bit, so we have some of that sense of what it's like to walk into a huddle with 10 other guys looking us in the eye, having the call, play confidently, and then execute over and over and over and be the hardest working guy on the team, I would imagine. What did you learn from your days playing high school quarterback that helped you later on in your career?
Great question. Nobody's ever asked me that. I think even though we have that commonality, our difference, I imagine, is that I wasn't very good at it and my team was lousy. We were 3-8 my senior year. What you learn is, this is another thing that I'd love to go back in time. I'd love to go back in time and play quarterback again, knowing what I know now, because I was still, I was 17 and I didn't have a ton of self-confidence. You would assume that a high school quarterback has tons of self-confidence, but I was constantly afraid, not of getting hit or getting intercepted, but the fact that you've got thousands of people watching you, and you're the one who touches the ball every single play, and it's all on you. And fortunately, we ran the wing T, so we had an amazing rushing attack. We had three running backs who just kicked ass. But so what I learned from that was I also had a lousy offensive line who had me on my ass all the time. But what I learned from that is trust. You
Yeah.
have to be able to trust everybody else. Uh, you have to be able to trust your line. You have to be able to trust your receivers to make that cut and be there when the ball is there. But it's also a two-way street. They had to trust me in return. And then, there were plenty of games where I just played piss poor and didn't earn that trust. But so it's always an ongoing thing. And it ties directly into when I became chief speechwriter right after the second inaugural. I didn't fully trust my team yet, even though I'd been working with them for 4 years. It's not like we had a completely fresh slate. It's not entirely that I didn't trust them either, but I felt this crushing inner need to prove myself because you're replacing somebody like John Favreau, who was a celebrity in his own right by that point. And I was very worried that people who paid close attention to politics would notice some kind of slip off in the quality of Obama's speeches.
Hmm.
And so I just wrote too many of them myself. And I actually ended up in Walter Reed Hospital in April 2013 with a bout of hypertension because we had just come through a week where it was the Boston Marathon bombing. It was background checks were blocked by Republicans in the Senate. We were just writing all sorts of crushing speeches on all sorts of different stuff. And it was my deputy, a guy named Terry Zuplat, who, I came out the next day, but he said, look, man, this isn't going to work if you don't let us write, if you don't trust us to write. We've been working together for 4, 5, 6 years now. You know what we can do. And I actually needed to hear that. And, part of good leadership is delegating and trusting the team around you.
Yeah. No doubt. I can imagine how hard that would be, though. Specifically, I think about writing in someone else's voice, especially for a prolific writer, which is not, I don't know if that's the norm for the president. If I think back, like how many of them are actually world-class writers? Not many. So that compounded with what I think would be the challenge of writing not in your voice, but in his voice. What's the mind space you got to be in to say, okay, this is how he would deliver. This is what he wants to say. I read that you said you thought and cared most about impressing him, the person, your boss, the person you're writing for, the president. What's that like writing not in your voice, but in his?
I've always likened writing for Barack Obama, called it a wonderful struggle. It's wonderful because he's such a talented writer, and that if your draft isn't where it needs to be, he can come in and take it to a better place. But the struggle is that we wanted to impress him every time. We wanted to get him a perfect draft every time, even though that's not what he was asking for. He's always asking. He viewed speechwriting as a collaborative effort, and he just wanted something he could work with. Learning to write in somebody else's voice is probably the hardest, most time-consuming part because you're not putting your own words out there. They're his. It's what he could write if he had the time. And honestly, I think he would have always preferred not to have speechwriters, but there was just no time for him to write 15 speeches for himself every single week while running the free world. There are a lot of similarities actually to what I said about being a high school quarterback. I wish I could go back in time and be a quarterback again, knowing what I know now. I also still wish I could go back in time and be chief speechwriter again, knowing what I know now, because I was, much like I was on the field, I was afraid a lot, even though, we started this podcast talking about how you have to cast off that fear, but I was always afraid of letting him down, writing something that was subpar. I always had imposter syndrome too. Like I never felt like I deserved to be there. So there was also this fear of being found out as a fraud.
Hmm.
And, fortunately I had someone like my wife around me and she worked at the White House too. It was like, if Obama didn't want you to be chief speechwriter, you would not be chief speechwriter. That much I promise you. He would have gotten rid of you right away. He wouldn't have hired you in the first place. Um, and the country knows that you guys are churning out this great stuff, and yet every single time you are given a new task, you're terrified. I actually think that fear, and I spoke about this in a commencement address once, fear can actually be a powerful motivator. Like people always say, you shouldn't be afraid to fail. I disagree with that. I think you should be so afraid to fail that you will do anything it takes to succeed. I was always so afraid to fail him and the American people and the people whose stories we were telling that I would pull all-nighters to make sure the speech sang. I would work weekends to make sure a draft sang. So I actually kind of used fear as a tool at times to get better.
Jim Collins writes about being productively paranoid, and I identify with that so much. I
I like
sense
that.
that's you. Like just it's because when you say you're paranoid, that's not good. So you add on productively paranoid
Yeah.
when it comes to your work. I feel that way before a speech, while writing, while podcasting, of preparing, of productively paranoid. I think like that this I get one shot. Like I want to make this thing. I love how you say I want to make it sing. I think that's I'm going to use that. But I got to make this thing sing. I want to make this as excellent as it can be. And that fear of screwing it up, the fear of failure, I'm with you, man. Especially because it comes from within. It's not coming from a boss. It's coming from within you of saying, I'm going to use this fear as my fuel in a way to work incredibly hard to make it as good as it could be.
That's absolutely right. And what's important is that Barack Obama wasn't the one who made me fearful. He was never the kind of boss who would say, "Give me something good or get out of here." I tell the story in great detail in the book about the Charleston eulogy, the Amazing Grace eulogy. And I spent all week kind of that week twisted in knots over this eulogy. Because it had a racial component too, which is always difficult to write about. And Obama, he didn't give me anything to go on, and he spoke about this on a podcast that he did where he gave me no guidance. He just said, talk about race, talk about guns, talk about the Confederate flag, and wrap it all up in grace. And you're just like, I don't even know where to begin with that. Um, so I gave him a draft that I knew was subpar, and I gave it to him the night before the speech, which was probably 2 or 3 days too late. And I told him as much. I said, look, I think the first couple pages are good. The second couple pages need you. And I'm sorry. And he said, no problem. I'll look at it. I'll make some edits. I'll get it back to you tomorrow morning. He called me back to the White House that night at around 11 p.m. And so I went back in. We were sitting in the residence, and he had made a bunch of edits to the first 2 pages and said, "You're right about those. They're fine." But the second 2 pages, he had just drawn one line through each, which he had never done to me before. And I'd had 3 days to do this draft. He rewrote it by hand in 3 hours and handed me 3 yellow legal pages with just his neat handwriting on it. And it was beautiful. And I actually apologized to him for the first time ever, because I felt like I had let him down in a really important week. And this is what makes him unique as a boss. He put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Look, brother, we're collaborators. You gave me what I needed to work with here. You'll see a bunch of your work in what I did. I just rewrote it a little bit. And when you've been thinking about stuff like race for 40 years, you'll know what you want to say too." And that's a really important thing. He could have just said, "You screwed this up, do better." Or even worse, he could have excised me from the equation. He could have given the edits to the chief of staff or somebody else to then hand to me, which would actually make me feel even worse. Instead, he took the opportunity to lift me up and walk me through what he did and make me leave there not feeling like a failure, but actually feeling pretty good about myself, even though I had to go spend 3 more hours kind of working his stuff into it. That's just the kind of boss he was, and it makes a big difference.
What a great lesson for leaders. Like think about that. I think sometimes you get like these expectations that maybe aren't realistic, which I understand because we want to strive for excellence. But to know how like you have such a valuable team member, like, hey brother, we're collaborators. This is how it goes. The world's messy people. To get to the end point, it's a bunch of squiggly lines. You know how it is. It's never just a straight, easy route. And I think that's what I loved. So I was getting ready to talk about this book. It's called Grace, and Cool picture on the cover, by the way, but what's inside is even better because obviously you're a great writer and a great storyteller, but just the combination of weaving these anecdotes and stories within this 10-day period. I mean, you're there for the whole time. He's there, chief speechwriter for 4 of the years, and you chose these 10 days. What made you choose these 10 days?
It's the sheer magnitude of the events that happened in these 10 days. When I was writing this book, I told people what I was thinking about, and they were like, "Dude, I remember all that. I did not remember it was all in the same week."
That's wild.
Somebody once wrote way before the book that it was too implausible for an entire season of The West Wing.
Remind us of what are some of the big events over the course of these 10 days.
Yeah, the book begins with the white supremacist massacre in Charleston, South Carolina, and unfolds through the president has to make a statement about it. The families of the victims forgive the killer at his arraignment, which was extraordinary. You start to see Republican governors in the South quietly bring down the Confederate flag over public spaces. And all the while, we're grappling with whether or not to give a eulogy. And the president and I did not want to do one. I didn't want to write it. He didn't want to give one. And we're also preparing for the Supreme Court to rule on Obamacare and marriage equality that week. And, there's a very real chance that they could tell millions of working Americans, sorry, you don't get health insurance. They could tell millions of gay Americans, sorry, you don't get to get married like the rest of us. You're second class citizens. And then Obama goes and gives the Amazing Grace eulogy and comes back to a White House lit up like a rainbow. And that's all in 10 days. But it's more than just the enormity of the events. It's what they all say about us as Americans. Every single one asks us, do we actually believe that all of us are created equal? Are we going to stand up against white supremacism and bigotry? Are we going to make sure that everybody who works hard gets a fair shake? Like, are we going to do anything about gun violence? Are we going to do anything about the fact that, African Americans have to walk past the Confederate flag every day to get to work? Like, there were all these questions that we just haven't grappled with over our, 240 something year history that all like were thrust upon us at the same time. And over those 10 days, we answered them all correctly. It was just like this remarkable little burst of progress in a country where our story is bursts of progress followed by backlash to that progress. And it just felt alive in real time. Democracy felt alive in real time. And it was just something I had to write about.
How about the singing? What went into the singing at the end, which is I'm thinking about this. The ultimate, man, you could really mess this thing up. This beautiful moment, it was from tragedy, obviously, but great eulogy. All right, I'm going to go for it. I'm going to sing. What went into that? What did you talk to him about before, after? What was that like?
It was all his idea. That's not the type of thing a speechwriter can write. You don't just write in the draft, sing here. And as part of his rewrite the night before, I had the phrase "Amazing Grace" in the speech, and that's basically where he tore it up. And he built the structure of the back half around the lyrics to "Amazing Grace," which was beautiful in its simplicity and one of those things I kicked myself for not thinking of. And that morning, Friday morning on day 10 of the 10 days, he went out in the Rose Garden and spoke about marriage equality, which the Supreme Court had just found a right to in the Constitution. And 5 minutes later, we're on the helicopter heading to Andrews Air Force Base to fly to Charleston. And he's still working on the speech because he is able to just shift gears instantly. He hands it back to me when we land on the helicopter and says, if it feels right, I might sing it. And that hadn't occurred to me either. And I just kind of looked at him and I was like, you do you, man. Because he's got a deep background with the AME Church. He knew they would be there to catch him, but it's still, he wouldn't be alone singing. But it's both a big leap of faith to do something like that, to sing in public, period, let alone when you're president of the United States. But it was also kind of a liberated fearlessness that he had earned over 7 years in office. And he's talked about this a little bit, where you can feel like a lot of the White House can feel like you're going over the Niagara Falls in a barrel, but you survived. And there's something that comes with that. There's kind of this liberated fearlessness where to mix metaphors, he's kind of an aging basketball player, right? When you can't necessarily dunk anymore, but you know that you can hit the shot when it counts. And that's sort of what I saw when he stood up there and sang it. It was kind of a fearlessness.
I think what it taught me as a leader, if you want an A plus performance, you have to go for it. Now, that also puts you at risk. It puts you at big risk for potentially ruining what led up to that was an A or an A minus. And I think there's a lot for all of us to learn from these moments. Like whenever you look in history of these times, like that was when the singing of that happened, that we all remember. And if you've forgotten, go back and Google it and on YouTube it. It's awesome. It just shows to get the A plus, you got to be willing to go for it. And I think as leaders, that's something for us to think about during our next town hall, during our next big speech, or even just a one-on-one. Like, are you willing to actually go for it and not play it safe, or not say, you know what, I'm going to do a solid B plus today. Like, no, I think today's an A plus day, but to get that A plus, I gotta risk it a little bit. And that's a really cool thing to think about, to internalize for us as leaders.
Yeah, not many leaders would have stepped up and sang like that, you know. And
Yeah.
it's interesting to think about too. I still don't know. I don't know if he would have done it or not had we lost both Supreme Court cases. You know, if you're coming off that morning having lost not just on the biggest domestic achievement of your presidency, but the fact that millions of Americans are going to lose their health care. You're coming off millions of Americans being told they can't get married. Does he still sing? I don't know. There's an argument to make that it's all the more important to sing. We actually had debates in the White House, not heated, but about lighting up the White House in rainbow colors that night, that same day as the eulogy. And somebody actually asked, what do we do if we lose? Do we keep it dark? And a young gay man on staff actually said, no, that's when it's all the more important to light it up and
Mm.
remind people that they still have a place in this country.
Um, I have something on a little bit of a less serious, although it turned out to be a great moment for you, about your resilience. So, earlier in your time working in the White House, I'd read that you had asked a fellow colleague, a member of the Obama White House who's on the research team, you asked the woman out 3 times, and she denied you all 3 times, which at that point, I think if it's me, I'm like, this just ain't it. I think I got to move on to the next one. But you didn't. And can you share that story about being rejected and then having the resilience to come back and make it happen?
Yeah, well, I mean, I need to be careful here, and I was very careful and nervous back then because this was I met this woman on her first day of work at the White House in 2011, and uh, you want to be very, very careful. I didn't want to get busted for sexual harassment, right? So
Yeah.
we became friends first, and I don't think I asked her out until we'd known each other for a few months. And she said no, and you're just cool about it right away, no problem. You just remain being an excellent colleague. An opportunity presented itself where we were at a party 2 months after that, and I asked again, and she said no. And this is when I'm starting to think like, do not mess with this. But then we were at a Christmas party together 2 months after that. And I asked one more time, and she still said no. And that's when I actually did tell myself, just this kind of tramples on your point about resilience. But I said, look, 3 strikes, you're out. Do not do this again. We are done.
Third time's pretty impressive, though. You still went for it. I don't know, maybe you were boozed up a little, but like you still went for it a third time. Yeah.
I actually went for the third time because one of her friends told me to.
Oh, okay.
And one of her best friends from college told me to. We were at the White House for a White House Christmas party, and she said, you need to ask her again. Um, and then I was starting to worry that it was a setup, especially once she said no the third time. I was like, what the hell? But that's when I shut it off. Although what changed my life was the next morning, she emailed back and said, I changed my mind. Let's go out on a date. And now we are married with a daughter who you've heard throughout the entire podcast. So fortunately, all's well that ends well. But um, that was risky and dangerous, and because you don't want somebody else at work to feel
Right.
pressured or like they have to say yes. So I was always very aware of that, and yet I knew that this was the person I wanted to spend the rest of my life with. And Kristen is all over this book.
Yeah. I just like this story because also I met my wife at work. A lot of people do, and I wonder how that's going to go now with people, not as many people working together. We have a few more minutes. I wanted to do one little excerpt from the book about fathers. I think you and I are also similar to have grown up in an amazing household with great parents. But that's not the case for everybody. And so I'm going to read this section to you and just ask you to expand on it and maybe even compare and contrast to your upbringing, my upbringing being similar to yours. But this is Father's Day 2013. President Obama met with a group of teenagers in Chicago's Becoming a Man program for at-risk youth boys. He spoke with them for over an hour, which apparently messed up the rest of the day's schedule because he went long. But a few months later, on Father's Day weekend 2013, you write that he invited them back to the White House this time. And prior to the meeting, the boys went to this local convenience store. And once when they are in the Oval Office, they gave President Obama a Father's Day card, and they'd all signed it. And one of the boys looked at him and said, I've never signed a Father's Day card before. And the president paused, really thoughtful guy, and he says, I've never signed one either. And to me, it just spoke to like, wow, like that's such a different world from what I'm used to. I think from you too. Writing that, thinking about that, being around that, how does that make you feel just as a whole when it comes to now you're a dad, you grew up with good parents, he didn't, and those group of boys didn't either. It's just amazing to see the differences amongst all the people that come to the same place.
Yeah. And that's what makes him such a good writer and wordsmith too. Like he could have said, oh, I never knew my dad either. But he's got this way of just saying, when he said, I've never signed a Father's Day card either. It's just this instant connection with these young kids who could never see themselves in the Oval Office, or who've probably been told you're never amount to anything. And then suddenly the President of the United States just flat out shows, not tells, I'm just like you. I'm so fortunate that I don't have any daddy issues or mommy issues. Like I just grew up loved, and I'm very, very fortunate for it. And, for all the differences that Barack Obama and I had, not just physical, but where we grew up, how we grew up, that never got in the way of our shared worldview. It made for much more interesting speechwriting and storytelling that he had such a vivid and varied life. But you're always aware of what his words mean to people, right? You don't have to tell this long, meandering, vetted to within an inch of its life story. This gets back to the fearlessness point. You can just say, I've never signed a Father's Day card either. And suddenly all those kids know exactly what that means. And it was just this amazing moment.
One quick last one, Cody, before we run, man, especially someone who's had an incredible career like you have and you're right in the middle of it. When you're meeting with someone who's maybe a recent college graduate and they ask you for advice, they ask questions, what are some general pieces of life/career advice you give to that person?
Yeah, I tell all my students this too. Show up and dive in. I actually wrote that into the farewell address for the same reason. All my students are all so torqued up about getting that first job, as if it will define the entire trajectory of your career. And that's just not true. Rather than waste time picking the first job, just get in there, join a campaign. You learn. Your first job is actually your best learning experience, even if you think the job sucks. Like, my first internship on the Hill, I was literally walking the senator's dogs, running memos around the Hill. But if you open up your eyes, you get to see a bunch of cool stuff. You get to read a bunch of cool stuff. You get to read about policy before it happens. You get to watch policy being made. And if you approach that first job as your best learning experience, that's really going to set you up in big ways for the future.
So good, man. I am so appreciative of you for doing this. I'm going to think about making speeches sing because of you. And I'm just real appreciative of the book, Grace, President Obama in 10 Days in the Battle for America. It's really well done. Amazing storytelling that weaves it all together. I don't know how you did it, but I'm glad that you did because it's really good. I encourage people to read it, regardless of where you fall politically. I think you'll enjoy this book. It's extremely well done. And Cody, I'd just like to say I'd love to continue our dialogue as we both progress, especially I'm reading a lot about what you do at Fenway and teaching. I think there's so much to learn in this space for us as leaders that's really important. So I really appreciate it, man.
Anytime, brother. I really enjoyed this. Thank you very much.
Thanks, man.